in the nick of time. Not that you know that, but it's been a mega rush to get here. But hey, we're here. Going to give it an opportunity for. That's the done thing, isn't it? At the start of these things, people say, "Oh, I'll wait for a couple of people to join in." But we are joined by the nice-ish psychologist who's just there. Hello, sir. Jump in the waiting room. Let me in. Hi, James. We'll get cracking as soon as possible. Me very kindly stepping in tonight because due to some unforeseen circumstances, Ricky is unable to meet us. I know Mike said, hello?
Hello?
Oh, you are. That is you, the blur, the scarlet pimple,
Yeah, that is.
the elusive figure. Hello, sir. Hi, Calum. You all right?
Hello, how are we all?
I thought I was going to get an Obi-Wan Kenobi hello there. Then.
Hello there. Yes, it feels like the band's back together.
The boy band. Yeah, Mike is a very, I think, more than appropriate fitting addition to the boy band.
Yeah, I agree.
Excited to see what he brings.
I know he's working late tonight, so he may very well jump in a little bit later. But yeah, thanks guys for giving up your time. I think I've kind of explained the premise, and I did go to check my messages to Calum today, and I'm gonna publicly admit to this. So Calum was on my list. Hi, Mike. Oh, Mike is home. And I went to check in on a message that I'd last sent him. And I don't know whether anyone else has ever found this, only to find I never actually sent that message. Calum doesn't know whether I'm telling that as the truth. It is the truth, of course. But I feel like that's one of those really poor excuses, like my dog ate my homework. But genuinely, I went to check up on a message and it just wasn't there. I was like, oh my God, how embarrassing. But thank you for hopping in. And there he is. Mike is going to seamlessly hop in as well. Is he there? There he is. Hello, Mike.
Hello.
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 Hi.
Mike, Calum, Mike.
Hello, Calum.
Hello.
Hello, Dan. I can see your waving hand.
Can you? I can't see a thing. And I had speech therapy as a kid because I had a forward lisp. So I had to do a lot of practicing of saying sausages and sandwiches. And I find saying nice-ish psychology brings a flood of that back. So I feel I need to do something about it. But thanks for giving up your time, Jen. So I hugely appreciate it. I kind of explained the premise to you, being Men's Health Awareness Month, and I couldn't think of people I'd rather share it with. So I've kind of reached out to a few of my favourite men and used this as an open opportunity to kind of just open a space. And I very much see this as less talk, more action, because I think we do a lot of the strength in speaking narrative, but no one actually knows what that looks like in practice, and that's quite a scary challenge, I think. And that's probably a good place to start, actually, just to gauge your opinions on the strength in speaking narrative for men, and you know, when we talk about men's mental health and it being different to women's mental health, what are your thoughts there?
Who's going?
Anyone?
I'll go.
Right.
All experts in my eyes.
Okay. I'll jump in because it's to pick who starts is always the challenging one when there's four. I would say that with the narrative around men's mental health, particularly from my own kind of experiences of the whole spectrum of kind of depression and then being in therapy, trying to kind of being in a place of then trying to talk, unpicking some of the barriers that I've had to that have been vast, and in the sense of just having a sense of connection with my own experiences, trying to make sense of my own experiences. And so part of that, those ideas of just generally talking, I'm not that I have masses of necessarily solutions, but I definitely feel that sense of like barrier to giving men, myself particularly still evolving within this, the language to be able to kind of articulate what they're experiencing, what even like from from a superficial point, like what they want. Like when we're in this place of maybe where I feel a sense of like disconnection from myself, what do I want? What do I need in that moment from someone to be made to feel safe in my own experience? So yeah, I think that there's a conversation to be had about, okay, well, how do we then help men generate that sense of language and being able and connection with what their needs are and also how they feel.
Anecdotally, Mike, if you don't mind me asking you, in that, as a general practitioner, do you find, obviously, like this is just based on your experience, there is a disproportionate amount of maybe men that you feel you have to kind of navigate this conversation more, that when they come to you, that it's a different line of questioning that you may need to ask, or you feel like they are limited in some capacity in terms of communicating what they mean?
The short answer is not really, but I suppose that part of that is perhaps to do with the fact that the people who do come to see me are the ones that have chosen to. So it's a kind of like self-selecting group in a way. So it's already somebody who's chosen to come and talk about it. There are times, obviously, when I might pick up on some signs of things with patients and kind of explore it with them not necessarily expecting it. And I think actually some of the data recently has shown that men are now as likely to seek help from a medical professional as they are women. As women are. They might still be less likely to seek therapy, I think, but they are statistically as likely. I don't know what the quality of that study actually is. It was just a statistic I read. I think it was on the Mind website or
Is
something
that the
the other day.
same one? I feel like it might be the same one that suggested that a lot of men that die by suicide have at some point sought out help.
No, this was a study. It was like a survey that was what's changed in men's mental health in the last 10 years, and
Right.
they basically compared answers to the same question. So I don't think it was like an in-depth study. I think it was more like a charity survey, and the answers suggested that actually men are becoming more likely to seek help. But yeah, there was also that statistic that a lot of the people who had ended their lives had sought help. And I'm not quite sure. I'm absolutely terrible at remembering numbers, so I can't tell you percentages. But I think that one of the things that we do, again, like this is one of the things that is frustrating me the most about social media at the moment, is like this differentiation between male and female depression as though it's two separate conditions. And there's not really, as far as I am aware, any evidence to actually suggest that like therapy is less effective in men or that medications are less effective in men. It's the same pathological process. I think the things that change are the risk factors, the things that end up like leading to men being depressed versus women being depressed. I guess are sort of some of the things that in terms of social values and stuff like that. But it tends to be based more around socialization than biological gender. So because we don't see the same things across different ethnicities and cultures because the social gender norms are different. Whereas if it was gender based, we would see it in different cultures as well. So I think it depends on what's valued by the society often. But I get, again, it's just is enormously frustrating because I think the more that we go on about how different it is for men and women, the more we kind of alienate people from each other. And we don't necessarily need to keep pushing this big difference. I think what we do see is that there is evidence that an individually tailored approach is really helpful and effective. So we should be tailoring it to the
That sounds
individual. But that's
like nuance to me. I'm not a fan of
that sounds like what?
it. Sounds like nuance
I
to me.
know.
Myself.
It's just all I'm saying. Like we just shouldn't be tailoring it to gender. We should be tailoring it to the individual. That's kind of the where I'm at with it. But because some women will struggle to talk about things in a certain way as well. And I think because we're like, especially on social media, everyone's coming from it with their own personal narrative. It becomes like this idea that because the men that talk about mental health feel a certain way, that's what men with mental health problems feel, and we have to be careful about like bundling everyone in together, I think.
Yeah. Thank you, Mike. Dan, what are your thoughts on this? Because I gauge, and this was when you were talking there, Mike, about like cultural differences and things like that. It was interesting. Something that came up on another one of these chats was that I'm giving a second-hand anecdote here, that it was brought up to Josh that was speaking that actually one of his friends or someone that he knows said that actually within his culture, mental health isn't a thing, and that it's almost like a complaint of privilege.
Yeah.
And my initial thoughts, just I say drawing my line in the sand, is there is no line in the sand. But my initial thoughts were it may manifest itself in different ways, it may be recognised in different ways, but it doesn't kind of ignore that it still exists. So I just wondered, like, your thoughts on, especially Dan, like the thought of privilege in talk around mental health. Is it a complaint of privilege?
So that's a question I've never been asked before, I'll be completely honest. But whilst I sort of let that percolate in the back of my mind, I just want to, you didn't see because obviously you can't see me, but when you were saying, Mike,
John C.
the narrative,
Sorry.
yeah, but when you were saying, Mike, around the narrative on social media about the differences between men and women's mental health and the differences in the need for different types of therapy, and it being a potential sort of conflation of the difference between biological sex and socialization and all that kind of stuff, I was just sort of like raising my hands and doing like a little bit of a dance, because this is something that I also, as a clinician and as a psychologist and somebody who works with both men and women in two different services, you're absolutely right. The depression is a feeling, and how you feel and how you relate to yourself and how you relate to the world. That's pretty much universal, in the sense that you might feel hopeless, you might feel helpless, you might feel like you don't belong, you might feel like you're a burden. And these are the ways, these are the qualitative ways in which we might feel about ourselves, which might sort of result in what we would then diagnostically call a state of depression, or a depressive episode, or depression as a mental illness. However, the trajectory and the path that takes us towards that feeling of isolation, helplessness, hopelessness, all that kind of stuff is very individual. And absolutely, yes, can gender play a part? For sure. The way in which men relate to the world or are seen in the world, and the way in which women are seen in the world or relate to the world, or the way in which they are positioned in terms of power, privilege, access to certain rights, etc., etc. All those things will definitely play a part in how somebody comes to feel depressed or be depressed. But are there differences in depression? Not necessarily, no, not that I know of, and not that anything that's ever been taught in me. There's differences in prevalence rates, there's differences in risk factors, like you said, Mike. There's differences in maybe the goals that people might want to try and achieve in order to sort of draw them out of their sort of depression or the difficulties that they struggle with. But you know, that's where the difference lies. And you're absolutely right. When we think about sort of people coming to therapy, I've spoken about this quite a lot in various different sort of forums recently. We formulate somebody's difficulties. We sort of have a discussion with them. We think about, you know, the journey that they've had, the life that they've had, the shape that their sort of depression takes, because, you know, diagnostically there is a set of sort of criteria if you're sort of diagnosing somebody against the DSM-5 or the ICD-10/11, I think it is now. So there's a set of criteria which kind of has to be met from a medical perspective in order for somebody to be diagnosed with depression. So what people will look for are those kind of things. And if somebody meets that, then a psychiatrist or potentially a GP, I don't know, Mike, can GPs diagnose depression, or is it purely, so a GP might diagnose you with depression, etc., things like that. The one area where maybe there is some slight difference, and I think there's an area of research that it's exploring this, is how people, men and women, might present when they're feeling depressed. So there is the more sort of maybe prototypical way in which women might present when they're depressed, but men can also sort of present in that way. So, sort of reduction in, energy, lethargy, staying in bed, lack of motivation, all that kind of stuff. I'm not going to wax lyrical about the diagnostic criteria. That's not my area of expertise necessarily. But for a subset of men, there is the idea that actually it manifests in sort of substance use, anger issues, sort of difficulties in relationships, sort of being really having really rupturous or fractious relationships, things like that. But again, that's about presentation and how somebody feels about themselves and how they, through their sort of coping skills or lack of coping skills or learned ways of coping, will then present through with their mental health difficulty, particularly depression or whatever we might be talking.
I've heard it described as that men tend to act out and women tend to act in and become sort of more into themselves, and that's had problems also with like the criminalization of mental health as well, because often if men act violently because of mental illness, they then get in the prison system incarcerated, and it becomes an issue from that perspective as well. So it's really interesting how it ends up with different outcomes too from that.
And then I guess sort of like, in terms of, if we're thinking about the sort of more extreme ends of the personality ranges that we all exist on, and those continuums, men will tend to likely within their criminal justice system potentially draw, well, depending if you're white or black, actually. If you're a white man, you're more likely to probably draw a diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder. Whereas if you're a black man, your behavior is probably more likely to be pathologized as mental illness. And you're probably more likely to, as a man of African Caribbean or African descent, be diagnosed with having schizophrenia. So therefore, they will end up in the sort of forensic mental health system. Whereas for women, they will tend to be pathologized with borderline personality disorder. Again, this is at the very extreme end of things, not sort of like the middle range, and not just your average person. But again, that's quite that kind of fits with what you were saying, Mark, about how men will tend to express their behaviors, and it will become a bit more violent, aggressive, maybe intimidating, domineering, that kind of take that shape. Whereas women, on the whole and on the in general, and again, this doesn't apply to all women across the board, but there is the consideration that women will tend to focus their distress inwards towards themselves, which is why I think then the counter statistic, and not in a who's got it worse, but the often used discussion around men's suicide is that women will tend to have higher rates of suicidal ideation, but then also higher rates of self-harm and potential and things like overdose attempts and things like that. But then again, that's because the sort of behaviors are more sort of internally or person focused.
That's really interesting. As I understand it as well, kind of socioeconomics plays such a huge role in that. The more affluent, the more affluent countries are higher rates of suicidality, like Japan, for example, America. There's a lot that plays into that. The access to firearms and like that in the States contributes to that, unfortunately and sadly. I wondered, well, like in terms of that, like the health space, and as we understand it, and this, I think when blame is at hand, we often look to certain people that may be getting a certain spotlight on them in terms of media exposure, sensationalist titles, and blaming certain individuals, certain things. But I think they're actually the byproduct of probably the larger issue. Why is it that we feel in young boys are looking to certain role models for that? And how crucial do you feel role models are in this conversation?
I think role models are essential to everybody. Like it's very natural for us to look at society and look at who we want to emulate. And I think that what's really difficult, I think, at the moment for men is that like the way that certain in society, it's quite difficult to tell what masculine traits are encouraged and are valuable and are helpful and are positive, and which masculine traits are toxic or being misinterpreted as toxic or being misinterpreted as masculine. What toxic traits, what toxic personality traits are being misinterpreted as traits of, boys will be boys and stuff like that. And
Mm.
I think that what makes it really difficult is that the narrative is so, like with everything in social media and the media, it's all junk. Like you will hear the phrase toxic masculinity banded around so frequently, but the majority of the people that talk about it and that pontificate about it aren't actually using the same definition of what it means, aren't actually necessarily cognizant of what the important factors are that are involved in discussing toxic masculinity. And so then you've got people thinking that toxic masculinity is the toxicity of being male, for example, rather than, specific traits that are often associated with masculinity that may have a harmful effect on men, women, and society as a whole, which I think is the generally accepted way that people define toxic masculinity. So if you bring up the topic of toxic masculinity in a dinner party, I think you will just get this completely like dichotomous conversation based on entirely different definitions of what the topic is actually talking about as well. It's a bit like the anti-diet movement and Hayes and all that kind of stuff. And because we live in this world of people wanting to do clickbait and polarizing content and all of that kind of stuff, like nobody actually cares about the truth. Or no, sorry, that's really, really generalist. Not
No,
nobody cares about the
I
truth.
think that's true.
Social media algorithms don't really care about the truth, they care about entertaining. And as a result, a lot of people have neglected to themselves care about the truth because they value, engagement over education and information and balance and all of that sort of stuff.
How can I
So
make my content go really viral without necessarily adding any kind of value to what I'm putting out there?
exactly. And so what we end up with is this situation where nobody knows what's good or what's bad, or who should be a role model, or who should be vilified, or whatever. And half the people that are being the really terrible role models are probably just making up half their views because they know that that's how to make a bunch of money on social media. And so I think that actually because of that, it's more important that there are positive role models, because that's, people need guidance because they do emulate people that they aspire to be like. I've known people that have become awful people because they follow awful people on social media and they think that that's the way to be. And that's, a sad fact of life, but it's always been there. Whether it's celebrity, whether it's, celebrities that people want to emulate, like bad boy behavior, like the Liam Gallagher and Noel Gallagher in the 90s, like, being real, whatever, or whether it's,
It's kind of effectively getting him almost like as people that existed pre-social media, getting him like with the wrong crowd, emulating the older boy. Cool.
It's just that we have much more access to different crowds now. Like before, in the 1900s, maybe you would have seen like people would have emulated the local businessman who's really successful, and he might have been awful, but it's just on a slightly different scale now, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
I've heard this concept threatened massively around and kind of a response along like the rise of things like incel, rise of like the red pill gang. I think is everyone familiar with the red pill gang? Kind of the anti-feminism, kind of vocal anti-women groups, and that comes with some of the strides we've made forward in terms of equality and women getting more out of society, which they maybe didn't have access to before. And the idea that men, or some men, I should say, are threatened in some shape or form. So it's almost double down behaving and embodying masculinity all of the traits that we kind of recognise aren't helpful for society as a whole.
One of the things that that particularly encompasses that and the idea of the role models is Tony Porter talks about that idea of, I think it's Tony Porter, he talks about the idea of the man box, and a lot of the things kind of still to this day on social media still lend to that kind of idea of ice baths and like I say, this kind of almost like this warrior mindset, which nothing against it. Do ice baths from time to time, but not generally not my thing. But that kind of one of the things about kind of connecting with so many other men is just bringing that ideas of like diversity to what a masculine role model can be. Like meeting people, I know we've had a mutual affection for people like Alex Holmes and David Chambers, and seeing like black men kind of in a much more softer embodiment of masculine traits, bringing more creative embodiments of masculine traits, as well as the the gym, the discipline, which again, love, nothing against it, all has its place, but I think particularly those bringing more diversification to an awareness and shining a light on some of these people that can just bring and be like, okay, I actually have a choice here, and I can see this person who is of similar age, race, likes, who's displaying, like, I love poetry as an example, and we'll post poetry on my Instagram, who's kind of embodying this idea of he goes to the gym and does poetry. And I was with my nephew the other day watching things like High School Musical, where guilty, really kind of catchy songs, and like when they're talking about kind of crossbreeding between baking a creme brulee and being the jock athlete and all of this kind of stuff. So yeah, particularly just extending on what you've kind of said there, the importance of role models, particularly for the likes of these young men, boys who are falling into these cultures like the red pill, incel culture. I think the more we can somehow shine a light on these people to see actually there is an option, like you have a choice. It's your definition of what it means to be a man. Can just cultivate that, create a sense of freedom into stepping into what it means for them.
And I think what's so difficult about that is that you know, like, actually, even in what you've just said, Calum, like, it's hard to explain that there's different ways of doing things without feeling like we're insulting other people. And you were quite apologetic about that. And I know that we had some people in the audience at the time who are super into ice baths, and it's hard because you want to say that there's another way, and you want to be inclusive and diverse, and yet you find again yourself almost apologizing for watching High School Musical and stuff like that. And actually, there's no, to me, there's no such thing as a guilty pleasure in that sort of sense, because actually, why do we pretend it's not okay to enjoy stuff? Like, why is, it's like, and I think that's part of the, when it comes to men's mental health, we promote things like suffering, ice baths, doing hard things. And I think those things are really important. I actually think that controlled, exposure to difficult things is really beneficial and is good for our resilience and all that kind of stuff. And I'm like you mentioned, I'm all for it.
Just why something's on the tip of my tongue, because I find the language that they use quite interesting, because in, I guess, like a more effeminate concept, we would call that self-regulation, whereas arguably ice baths, controlling yourself, is self-regulation, but we don't call it that. So often the distinguishing thing between the same thing is just the language we use. So for an aggressive man, it's like that's a favourable attribute to have, but then that might be for a woman a difficult woman, because she's, so it's these changes in languages for essentially describing the same thing. Sorry, I interrupted you.
Well, no, I mean, I just was saying that, like, we don't have the same encouragement encouragement of just enjoying stuff because you enjoy it,
Yeah.
like actually. And it's and you're talking about something like, if you think about, because I've always had this all my life. I've been I'm really contrary when it comes to music. So I've always been really unable to like anything that is globally popular. And so, like, you know, my rebellion in the 90s was to, you know, to listen to pop music when everyone was listening to indie music. So like, from my perspective, you're choosing to do something that is of no harm to anybody, that is of no, it doesn't create any ill health, doesn't cause any problems, or it's just the music that you have in your ears and that you listen to and that your brain and your heart and your soul enjoy, and yet we feel embarrassed about it. It's total insanity. But yet we are quite happy about drinking and taking drugs and going out on the lash and doing the, like, the lad things. And so, like, there are some things that we're allowed to enjoy, but there are some things that we're embarrassed that we enjoy. And I just think that that's insane. Like, I think that, you know, it's all right to be apologetic. It's a guilty pleasure if it's harmful, perhaps, but it's not a guilty pleasure if it's harmless, of something that you
Just
enjoy.
brings you pleasure.
Sorry.
And just brings you pleasure. Just brings you
Exactly. What's
a little
guilty
just
about it?
brings you,
Yeah.
exactly, just, you know, something that just brings you a little pocket of joy, a little moment of happiness, something that just brightens your day and just makes you, you know,
Yeah.
enjoy yourself. You know,
Yeah.
what's so wrong with that? I completely agree. Yeah.
I gather there will be perhaps not that they definitely won't be watching this, but then a group of men that maybe would describe something like banter, harmless fun, and just something that they enjoy, when arguably, based on like the definition you gave there, that is actually causing harm to others. Like, where does banter fit into that? And when do we grow out of banter? Like, is there a line?
So yeah, so I have an interesting relationship with banter, in the sense that I only realized this maybe sort of as I got older and sort of thought about it a little bit more. But you know what you were talking about, kind of the idea of the man box. Um,
Bantosaurus Rex.
I read a, I read I read a book called The Me Too Handbook for Men, written by Mark Green, who's amazing, by the way. Just a really good sort of progressive, forward-thinking man around all things masculinity and male feminism and all sorts of stuff. But I read this book, and he talks about sort of how um, we as men are conditioned to keep ourselves within the man box or keep others within the man box. And actually, bullying is one of the ways in which we do it. So the idea that you've watched High School Musical, if you'd come out and admitted that 20 years ago, somebody would have come back and sort of questioned your sexuality in a really unhelpful homophobic way, because that apparently is not something that somebody who is heterosexual would do. So that's the kind of language that would have been used.
We actually,
And
in the chat last time, sorry to interrupt you, Dan, is that we were having one of these conversations. I don't know who it was, one of those cryptic avatars, but it was "This is so gay." That was their
yeah,
comment.
I saw that.
Having this,
I
oh
saw
yeah,
that.
yeah, having this conversation.
Which again is a really sort of immature, you know, immature response to
But
people
also,
just
like,
trying to have a
yeah,
conversation about life.
are we still using that as a term?
Exactly.
Like,
Yeah. Like, you know, that's so 90s really, that in itself. But on a lower level, banter is one of those more subtle ways in which we police ourselves as men, or we police each other to remain within the confines of the man box. So often banter can be used, and I'm not saying there isn't anything wrong with banter. Banter is, you know, if used appropriately, it's good for levity. It's good for creating, you know, bringing humor to particular situations. There's actually nothing wrong with having a laugh. Humor is great. Like, you know, I'm not trying to say we should all walk around being fucking miserable robots. That's absolutely not my stance on life. But there is, in certain circumstances, a time and place where banter is actually used to police and curb behavior that would fit outside a socially constructed norm of what masculinity is. Um, and that's my view on banter. So I sort of, thinking about it now, um, I reflect on the moments in my life where I was is effectively schooled and policed, and my behavior or my lack of achievements in terms of certain areas of being a man or growing into a man or developing into manhood were questioned, and I was teased and cajoled in like a matey kind of way. But actually, effectively, the message that I was being fed is that you're not doing this growing up into a man right. You're deviating from the predicted trajectory and path. And, my own way of becoming who I am, or the man that I am today, was deemed outside of the norm. And in order to make sure that I was, sticking to it, and this was largely around sort of women and girls and dating and, going out. And so you mentioned, Mike, about the idea that the way in which we sort of have fun, or the expected way that we can have fun as men, is to go out, get pissed, do drugs, all that kind of stuff. One of the things that there was a lot of pressure on when I was at uni and going out was like finding a girl to pull and walk away with successfully at the end of a night of having met a random woman and either snogged her, got a number, or even sort of taken her back for a one-night stand. And that kind of, because I wasn't necessarily the most Casanova-esque type individual in my uni years, I wasn't like, they weren't like not friends with me, and they didn't sort of like say that I was an awful person, but there was some, a bit of teasing and a bit of, judgment about my lack of prowess in that particular area. But that came across as banter, when actually what I was being told is that I'm not necessarily fitting a typical sort of lad-esque type role of being somebody that can go out on a night out and just pull or snog any woman that I choose.
I guess it's like where does the line become? It's just a bit of banter, and it's actually exposing and humiliating their deepest, darkest insecurity. So I know there's a lot of ridicule about just using men as men's hairlines, for example, or their muscularity, or how lean they are. They've got a bit of a gut and they're in the middle age, and all these things. But we don't. Where does that cross the line actually into cruelty and it's not banter?
Yeah.
How do we establish?
I think it crosses the line when we feel like when the person who it's being done to doesn't like it,
Yeah.
and sometimes that actually can be really hard to figure out. I mean, I've certainly found myself in situations with, in fact, I used to be in a group of friends that was very, very, very bantery, and like you convince yourself that you enjoy it, you're in on it, you do it to each other. And then I started to make other friends that didn't behave like that. And when I would say, when I would perhaps do a bit of banter to them, they'd be like, "What? Why doing that?" I was,
Guys,
and they didn't. But it's just like they didn't find it funny, and they didn't get like why. I don't understand if we're going, if people are going to the pub together, why are they trying to get each other to drink more? Like, surely you just have what you want, and surely you just drink and eat what you want.
Why
And it's like this revelation.
Why are you being called a pussy because you can't down a pint in one go? Like,
Yeah,
what's that about?
yeah,
How is that? How is that like, cool, bro? I'm your best friend, but actually you're a loser because you can't
yeah,
crack 500,
yeah.
500 mils of a really fizzy alcohol in one go.
And my favorite thing about this was that actually I was the one that ended up getting removed from the lads WhatsApp group because I made a joke back at somebody, and it was about cheese. It was a joke about like high protein cheese or something. It wasn't even anything like personal, and it just it sort of made me reflect and look back. And it was funny because actually I had a birthday, and I had a load of people out for drinks, and I had like some of my sort of older, like those sorts of people, and then some of the newer people, and someone sort of took, one of my newer friends took me aside and said, you know what I just didn't really like about that? I felt like that person, everything that he said was at your expense. Everything that he said was some sort of subtle dig at you. And I was like, oh, yeah, but it's just, it's just bants. And then when I started to actually think about all of the things that the conversations that we'd had and the things that had been said, I was like, oh no, actually, I don't think I like that.
Mm.
But I think it, you know, when you're in it and when you believe that to be the normal way in which people interact, you just sort of accept it as part of normal. But I think that, you know, like I think it's our own responsibility to go, because you know, I think we've been in this situation before. And then how do you respond? You go, do you know what? Actually, I don't like it when you say those things.
Mm.
And actually, I found every time I've actually done that, people have been quite taken aback and surprised and gone, "Oh, I'm really sorry. I didn't, you know, didn't mean to do that. I won't do that again if you don't like it."
And the thing that
I
I
feel
find,
that's a really difficult conversation to have, perhaps younger, whether it's something that gives them a more confidence in your own skin and your ability to serve yourself and that. Because
Definitely.
I know I'd be able to turn around and say that now. So, like, as someone that was hugely insecure about their shape and size growing up, and I think this is just how culture changes, because I was having this conversation about how I couldn't have maybe had that conversation with a friend at that
Hmm.
time. But actually, let alone a friend, if I couldn't go to a teacher and say, you know what, I don't want to do skins shirts because I'm actually really like the teacher would have ridiculed me,
Yeah.
let alone my friends. So the confidence and the courage to bring those things up, I think that is positively shifting, but
Yeah.
challenging can be challenging at times.
Yeah.
And I think you get certainly you get a feel for the people you may naturally gravitate away from the
Yeah.
old for those reasons.
Yeah. No, I agree.
One of the
I
things
think the,
that, go on, Dan.
sorry, I was going to say, just the thing that I think that was interesting to note is that what you were saying, Mark, about how you didn't know that there was anything wrong with banter, or that it was just part of your sort of friendship group and the culture, and that's just what friends do. And I think that's the challenge, isn't it? And I think that that's why this kind of conversation is really helpful, because actually, if you're somebody in a group of friends that's grown up with that type of banter,
Hmm.
that type of way of relating, um, and you don't know any difference, you can't necessarily always maybe feel that how you feel in response to that banter. You don't have a you don't have anything else to measure it against.
Yeah.
So you don't know that actually, as men or as boys, there is a way of relating and being friends that doesn't involve banter or belittling or demeaning you in some way.
Hmm.
And if you don't know that there are friendship groups out there that exist that will actually just be nice to you and won't treat you like shit, or if you don't know, you maybe don't feel able to then turn
Hmm.
around and go, actually, the way that you spoke to me didn't make me feel good, because actually then what you're going to get back is the, oh god, can't you take a fucking joke,
Hmm.
or it's just banter, or don't be such a knobhead or anything like
It's
that.
how you
So
internalize, well, isn't it?
exactly.
Yeah.
You
And I
know,
think the thing
is there
that's
something wrong with me because I can't take banter? Is the issue me?
exactly,
My
yeah,
feelings are hurt by this.
yeah,
Do I just need to? And then I guess that where things like, do I just need to man up from, or just
yeah.
man up, deal with it?
Hmm.
It's only bad.
Yeah, and I think the thing that, so then coming back to the one of the questions that you had earlier, Dan, about role models, is that I think conversations like this, and I think gentlemen like yourself, are such welcomed, refreshing um, counter arguments, counter um, cultural representations of what it means to be a man, that needs to be celebrated more. But the thing is that you all exist. Like, there are pockets of all of you in and around people's social spheres, and it's just, I think, the thing that I am quite a strong advocate about is that when people talk about role models, or when we think about role models, I often think that people conflate the idea of role model versus a visible person. So somebody who's in the spotlight, somebody who's really famous, somebody who has a big influence of some kind. But actually, what I think about when I think of role models is who is local to you, who is somebody that you can aspire to, that's realistically achievable, attainable, who embodies a life or a way of living that you can realistically go out and achieve. Because the other thing that you talked about was role models, or maybe the question that was related to about role models in the and talking about men's mental health and all that kind of stuff. I think it's fantastic that more and more celebrities are coming out and talking about their mental health and all that kind of stuff. but also the lives and the ways in which people might go about sort of healing their mental health difficulties or dealing with it are so far removed from what sort of like an average person might be able to achieve and attain, that actually
Yeah.
it does, it's all like, okay, well, it's all well and good that, you know, the Rock had depression XYZ, but for the common man, how do I relate to the Rock, and how do I relate with his experience of depression? Which is not to say that somebody can't relate to it, because again, like we talked about, the experience of depression is the experience of depression, and it's very unique. But actually, when you're talking and when you're thinking about, like, you know, how does somebody like the Rock overcome that, and how do I, you know, he's him and I'm me, and look at him and look at what he's got. It just, there's just that sort of distance, that vastness of comparison that maybe makes it slightly um, the, the way in which you relate to that person, that individual, isn't quite the same as what you might relate to gentlemen like yourself, and you know, and your experiences of any mental health difficulties that you may have, and how you talk about it, and the things that you kind of go about um, doing to sort of look after yourself, which I'm going to come back and answer now a question that you asked, Dan, about privilege and mental health. Sorry, I've just come full circle.
No. Please
because I've
do.
just been thinking about it. So my answer to that is, I think mental health and mental health difficulties, mental illness, I think in relation to privilege, I think it doesn't discriminate in terms of privilege, because obviously I think people from all walks of life can experience mental health difficulties, mental illness. What you talked about in terms of the socioeconomic strata, I think there is a inverse sort of diagram, maybe, that potentially the more access you have to resources to look after yourself, the less likely you are to potentially have mental health illnesses. Which is not it's not 100% definitive thing, because people can have really challenging lives in, you know, their on their path to becoming a sort of wealthy person, but definitely within the lower socioeconomic strata of life, the likelihood of developing a mental health illness is much higher. Which then, my answer to that is that I don't think necessarily that mental health and privilege I don't think that mental health is a privileged conceptualization. I think it's a European conceptualization. I think what you mentioned about in terms of culture, I think different cultures, different ethnic groups conceptualize mental illness in a different way. The way that we understand mental illness is very Eurocentric, very sort of white European, a very white European way of conceptualizing mental health. But where privilege does come in, I think, is how, and especially on social media, managing and coping with mental illness is framed. Because there is a lot of, like what you all talked about, ice baths, mindfulness, taking 10 minutes out of your day to go for a mindful walk or get into nature or get into all these things, which are absolutely 100% really good for your mental health. How accessible is all of that stuff to somebody who's on the lowest strata of the socioeconomic ladder, who is living from month to month, from paycheck to paycheck, looking to feed their family, looking to not get fired from their job, looking to maintain all the things that they need to just live, to just exist, but then also, you know, having their mental health, which is, you know, and all that stress is compounding on their mental health. How simple and how helpful is it to see on social media that all you need to do is wake up at 5:30 in the morning and go for an ice bath dip, and that will just reset your day. I think
Yeah.
that's where the privilege aspect sort of maybe comes in, is that I think what social media offers in terms of help are just quick fixes. They don't address the sort of more vast systemic societal issues that may really impact the more underprivileged individuals, who will be more likely impacted by mental health difficulties.
I, I,
My
I think also part of the problem with that sort of narrative is that I think it plays a lot on the stigma around mental health and mental illness. And I think that part of the issue is that often we see mental illness, or a lack of mental health, or a lack of mental well-being, or a lack of mental resilience as a weakness. And we see being able to overcome obstacles as a strength. And I think that that is, again, a bit like with weight loss, it's valued at any cost. So if you are able to withstand huge amounts of adversity, even if it's at the cost of your happiness and your mental health, it's still applauded. And so I think, like, we often hear people talking about, oh, you know, people survived the war and all of that sort of stuff. You know, I would argue that nobody particularly wanted to be in a war. They just had to do it because it was there and it was happening around
It's
them.
not like
And so it's
they were
not
having. It's not like they were having the best time of their life whilst doing it.
exactly.
Yeah, no
They
one was
didn't have
like,
a choice, and they didn't have access to things like therapy and talking about it and medication and whatever it might be that might help them deal with it. And they probably did all suffer from certain degrees of, you know, post-traumatic stress and things like that as well. Great that they got through it, but are they happy, well adjusted and healthy? Or do we have a big problem amongst our elderly population in that they don't seek help when they need it? They find it difficult to, you know, to ask people to help them or to rely on other people. They are often quite isolated and lonely. You know, I think that there is, in opening up the mental health conversation and in encouraging people to take care of their well-being, we conflate often with weakness. Oh, you need a bath, do you? You need to go out for a walk for your mental health. You know, I survived a war. It's just it's kind of, it's a bit silly, really, when we think about it. Okay, you survived a war, but how are you doing now? And I think that we again don't often look at all of the right metrics when it comes to thinking about survival and prosperity and all of that sort of stuff, I guess.
Yeah, and living a full and fulfilled life, not just surviving it, getting through it, which arguably a lot of the older generation did. I'm just going to use this opportunity now, just because I'm hugely aware of the time, your valuable, precious time everyone's giving up this evening. If anyone who is watching has any questions at this point, if you want to throw them in, please do. I wanted to talk a little bit about, we were talking about identity and we were talking about the ability to endure, and very much what I see in the whole space is this, I guess, like, and not the disparity between men and women, but I guess, like, culturally and as a society, women are brought up, at least encouraged to be more within these nurture circles, whereas what I see, especially within health, is this lone wolf mentality and going it alone. Do you feel that plays a dynamic in this conversation as well?
I would. I think if we're talking within a health and fitness field, like, the narratives are very. I think they play into each other a lot. I think the ideas of, hopefully, it's been debunked for those that kind of know it, but there's still a sense of, I think, because going back to what you were saying, it kind of links back to the banter point. There's almost like that with banter becoming, and other means kind of off that, similar to that, become a kind of a very familiar form of relating to men, as we were discussing, to each other, as we were discussing. There's very, I don't want to generalize, but this kind of feeling of what it means to be safe within another person's company is something I don't believe a lot of men, well, not enough men anyway, have access to. And so that sense of then looking at these kind of feelings that, certainly from my own experience, that I'm having about myself, that I am somehow weak, or I am less than, or I am incapable in some way. And then it's almost like, okay, well, how can I then play into this almost like performative nature of them being a man, and being like, okay, how can I then not allow that kind of part of me to be seen? Like, how can I kind of hide that away? And like, some of the lengths, the things that have kind of, that I've experienced, in the sense of just absolutely, I look back now, just kind of like stupid things, like being a 21-year-old self-employed person and getting a fine for not paying my taxes on time, because who teaches you about taxes? Because I was just like, I must know the answer. But it was just that, it's that again, those kind of ideas of man needing to be a a picture of certainty and knowledge and strength and stuff like that, that anything that then detracted away from that kind of then played for me into that kind of like alpha wolf, lone wolf, not necessarily alpha, but lone wolf kind of idea, because of these ultimately these ideas and constructs of a man that I am trying to uphold.
Yeah, it's that resonates. I automatically think of how it's almost been embodied in that it's jacked individuals that are physically capable of crushing everyone. Sometimes sword wielding, especially when we look at the entrepreneurial side. Certain groups that get together, and being masculine is all about making loads of money, you know, waving a sword in the air, publicly celebrating certain achievements or monetary wealth and things like that. And I think all of these aspects feed into a certain identity, and I guess it's almost become a bit of a stereotype within health and fitness, that not only you jacked and you look a certain way, that you've got to dress a certain way, that you've got to earn a certain amount of money, that you must, I don't know, you must have a certain sexual preference, you must like Nando's, you must love going to the gym with your bros, and all of these other things. And I think just all these different narratives feed into each other quite nicely in the health and fitness space. I'm not necessarily sure they're all for positive reasons.
Can I just ask you a question, Calum?
Yeah, go for it.
So you mentioned that I guess one of the things that maybe goes against men connecting, I think is what you were saying, is that we might not necessarily always feel safe in each other's company. We might not feel safe around each other, and I agree with it. But I guess I just wanted to, you know, why do you think that is? What creates that sense of unsafety?
I personally, it is, I think for me, the unsafety is the judgment, is the experiencing of judgment, and having, say, this multi-dimensional part of being, in the sense of like I can be strong, I can engage in those kind of things, but having these other parts of myself where at times, speaking very generically, I might be sloppy, I might be weak, I might be not so put together in this man box. And so it's almost like the inherent, I think this is, I don't want to necessarily kind of put that specifically just to men, because I'm sure it's the same for all genders, but this idea of just threat to belonging, withholding of love, it comes down to those needs that are just universal, of love, belonging, a sense of,
it's like there's a fear of being ostracized and not accepted. What health and fitness does is it does create a community of people. It does create a community of like-minded people. I quite often speak of this idea of like although you feel unsafe in some of the characteristics you might display, and almost like falling into a certain set of behaviours provides a predictable unsafety. And I can stick with that because that has a clear trajectory, and I know I am accepted within the fold within that. Whereas the unknown, the unpredictable aspect of being more myself and not maybe embodying in that it is to be a man, or like by most people's standards, I don't know how that ends up. Does that mean like I'm humiliated? Does that mean I'm outcast? Does that mean I don't have a place in this space? So it's like comfortable in the discomfort of predictable unsafety, but being so adverse to actually trying something new because I don't know what the result of that is.
And actually, the result of being a more sort of authentic version of yourself might, as you say, or as both of you have said, result in judgments or potentially being outcast, ostracized, or thought of as less in some way. Yeah, no, thanks for sharing that. I think sort of the thing that popped into my head when you mentioned that was again, referencing Mark Green, was the idea that we currently, in sort of terms of masculinity, we sort of exist in a dominance-based sort of masculinity. So there's a lot of dominance, there's a lot of competition, there's a lot of one-upmanship, there's a lot of trying to prove we are who we say we are within the realms of being a man, and that actually, and again, talking very generally, and this is not for all men, and this is not for all male spaces, and etc., but there is, I think, something quite, poignant about what you said, that we can feel less than certain or less than comfortable, maybe, in and around some spaces with some men. I certainly know that I am who I am, and I certainly feel more comfortable in groups of women. Like, I can quite happily sit down and I can talk to a group of women quite comfortably without fear of being judged too much. I'm not saying I'll never be judged by any of the women that I ever speak to in my life, but I don't feel that sense of ease when I'm in a group of men. I, I don't dislike going to the pub. So, well, I don't dislike going to the pub, but I know that if I go to a pub, like what you were saying, Dan, I'm going to have to pretend in some way to be a slightly different version of the man that I am. I used to. Now I don't give so much of a shit anymore. I'll be quite honest. And when people are like, "So what football team do you support?" I'm like, "I'll be honest with you, I don't like football. I think it's quite a boring sport." Yeah.
Do you know what? My idea of hell is going to a pub and watching the football.
Yeah,
like, that does not appeal to me in any shape. I know that's going to upset anyone that watches this.
No, so like, I don't fault anybody for liking football. You like what you like. I just don't see the appeal. And quite like you, Dan, I'd rather smash my head against the wall than go and sit and watch a football game. I'll go for the beer. I'll go for the beer, and I'll go for the chat. I'll go for the conversation. But what inevitably happens is that, obviously, because we're watching a football game, people will talk about the football. They'll talk about the league. They'll talk about the sort of ups and downs and the players. And because I've got no interest in that, I've never learned about it. So my eyes just kind of glaze over, and I just sort of,
or you're in, or
withdraw slightly from the conversation. Yeah.
In too deep, sitting on a throne of lies. Yeah, I loved it when they scored the net at the end of the game. That was my favourite.
Really, so the comedy moment in a TV show that I most resonated with was, have you ever seen the IT Crowd?
Yes.
When both of them go watch the football match, and Richard Ayoade's character is like, "Oh, look, the team has put the ball in that goal, and now look, the other team has put the ball in that goal." Literally laugh my ass off, because that is how I understand football, and that's my response to football. I'm like, yay.
Out of everything that's been said today, that perhaps is the most controversial thing.
But I guess coming back to what you were saying is that it's not that I feel unsafe in that space with those men, because I don't think that any of them are going to cause me harm. I don't think that I'm going to be ostracized for it, but there is a sense of, I can't relax fully, and I can't be who I am as I am at home, where I would much rather sit and binge watch like a Netflix series or Disney, or I'd much rather look up the IMDb stats about the films that are coming out and rate them. That's my level of nerd, and that's the thing that I get excited about.
I thought that was my top trait. IMDb. I watch anything with scouring IMDb and finding out where all the actors are from.
But exactly. So, but very rarely can you walk into a pub and say to anyone, "So, how, like, on IMDb, what would you rate the latest?" Like, you can't have that conversation. That's not the conversation to have, is it?
Well, it depends what pub you go to. That would be a pub
But why not? Like, I'd actually think, and I would hazard a guess that actually, if you start having those conversations, that's when you find your people, and that's when you find the people that resonate it, and you actually find out that half the other people in the room don't want to talk about football either. And that's what I find really fascinating about it, is that when you actually just start authentically talking about the things that you feel passionate about, you end up finding the right people that want to hang out with you anyway.
And to be fair, like you're right. So, you know, I will go in and I will now, I'm a lot more confident to just say, actually, I don't really watch football. I'm just here for whatever.
Yeah.
And they'll be like, okay, so what do you do? What do you like? And then I can launch into, like, I won't, you know, I'll pick my conversations based on the assessment of the crowd that I'm with.
Mm.
But, you know, I'll often talk about sort of hobbies or my job, etc. Things like that. So no, you are right. You are right, Mike, in the sense that if you just, like, you know, admit and you just say, oh, you know, this isn't necessarily my scene. Somebody somewhere will be like, okay, so what does interest you, or what do you find interesting, and then you might be able to have a conversation about that.
The most heated debate I've had recently is actually whose favourite dancer is on Strictly. Those are more of the conversations I want. Guys, I'm gonna wrap this up. We've flown by through an hour. I'm so grateful for you giving up your time. I really appreciate it. I'll do this if you don't like as a collab thing. I'll share it, tag you, etc. And I just conscious that I think these conversations and catch up are really useful. I find them incredibly useful. I think other people listening to them will find them. They're not structured, they're not planned. It's just been really nice speaking to you all. So thank you for giving up your time.
Yeah.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you very much.
And everyone, thank you. Yeah, we'll keep these going. Sorry, mate.
I was saying, nice to meet you, Mike. I know Calum. I've met him before, but I've not met you, Mike. So nice to meet you.
Privilege.
Nice to meet you.
That is true privilege.
Just to echo what you're saying, Dan. I think I mentioned this in my sort of stories the other day. Like, I think if more men can have conversations like this that are more accessible and publicly available to actually hear what a conversation amongst men is like, that isn't massively gendered in one way or the other, I think is really, I think it's really constructive, and I think, you know, what you're doing with these conversations over this month is really valuable. So well done for doing it.
Agree. Well done, Dan.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate you. Everyone else, that continues through the month of November, and who knows after that. Thanks. Have a good evening.
Cheers.
Bye.